Well, as the U.S. presence in Afghanistan draws to a close, neighboring Iran is watching developments with alarm. An article in the Washington Post details the fraught history between Iran and the Taliban. And as the Taliban seizes more and more territory, including a key border crossing with Iran, the Iranian president-elect and the supreme leader are striking a friendlier tone. An ultra-conservative Iranian newspaper with ties to the government proclaimed, quote, "The Taliban today is different from the Taliban that beheaded people." So the Washington Post article was written by Miriam Berger, who is joining me now to talk more about this. So Miriam, why is Iran softening its tone towards the Taliban?
Well, thank you for having me on. The swift takeover of territory by the Taliban has caught lots of different actors a bit by surprise. And so the Iranian leadership has for several years now been, developing ties with pro-Tehran factions of the Taliban. And now they see it as in their perhaps better interest to, have sort of a foot in the door, somewhat friendlier relations. And that the Taliban are going to be there to stay to some degree in the Afghan government going forward, and that it's better to have them there than to have chaos and civil war and perhaps the sort of emboldenment of other extremist groups who the Taliban have themselves been fighting, who Iran also opposes.
The intelligence community here has sort of warned that the Afghan government may not be able to hold on to power for as little as 6 months, maybe 12 months after the U.S. Withdraws. Is there a possibility that Iran could become maybe a major player or influencer in Afghanistan once the U.S. has left?
I mean, they definitely would like to be. They just this week or on Wednesday hosted the Iranian officials in Tehran hosted Afghan and Taliban officials for some talks. Afghanistan and Iran have a long history going back. Iran doesn't have the same kind of proxies that it has in other countries like Syria and Lebanon, so it doesn't have that kind of foothold. But I mean, there's with the U.S. leaving, there's a very, very big void that many groups are seeking to try and fill and to get their leverage in.
Mm-hmm. So here's the thing, though. Iran is Shiite. The Taliban is Sunni. So they sort of, at least theirs are kind of at odds ideologically, if you will. What was the relationship like between Iran and the Taliban before, when the Taliban had control over Afghanistan?
Yeah, the two groups, have long not gotten along. Obviously within the Taliban, there are different factions to it. But, in 1998, Taliban insurgents attacked an Iranian consulate in northern Afghanistan, killed 8 Iranian diplomats, 1 Iranian journalist, and the two sides almost went to war over that. And, that attack is really seared in the minds of a lot of Iranians. And, the history of Taliban attacks against Persian and Shiite minorities like Hazara and other groups in Afghanistan also, and the sort of, the level of repression really bothers a lot of Iranians. And so there is this sort of longstanding tension. And, the government in Iran itself is very conservative and repressive. And so, the two have a lot that keeps them apart. But I think right now this void is also showing or leading to some sides trying to see, okay, how can we at least coexist? Because it seems like that's what's going to be happening going forward.
Pretty much, yeah. I was going to say, no one wants to see a civil war. It's clear the Taliban is here to stay. What is the best, or it certainly seems as if that's the case, what is the best case scenario in Afghanistan when it comes to Iran?
I don't think anyone really has a best case scenario right now for, any of the actors involved. Definitely one of the things that Iran is very worried about is, chaos and civil war breaking out. And so you would have, millions more, perhaps, refugees coming over to Iran. Iran already hosts a significant amount of Afghan refugees, most of whom are undocumented or, not officially registered. And so it doesn't want sort of an influx more people. It doesn't want an influx of weapons and narcotics. Also, there's a huge drug issue also in Iran, tied with, drugs coming in from Afghanistan. and it doesn't want militants. The Islamic State of Khorasan, the sort of the affiliate in Afghanistan, is also, a threat to Iran, and a group that the Taliban have themselves been fighting against. So I think the sort of best case scenario for Iran is to not have that happen, is to have some sort of, power sharing deal in which the Taliban continue to take territory and gain power, but don't, attack and kill civilian populations en masse, which so far is what we haven't seen. Mm-hmm. So far, you basically having the Taliban retaking territory by making deals with different local leaders. Over the last 2 decades, it's also expanded its reach and sort of its own ethnic diversity within the group. And so I think sort of a slow and not too violent takeover of territory and some sort of, governing coalition deal is how Iran sees its best interests being met.
So is there some merit to that headline that this is a different type of Taliban? I don't focus too much on Afghanistan, so I can't really answer that too well here. But I mean, yes and no. I mean, every group changes. Nothing's static. Right.
But, a lot of the basics of being quite hardline and Sunni, militant extremist, what the group has said is that they won't attack civilians. They won't attack NGO workers, foreigners, that U.S. soldiers are their threat, but not the other foreigners who may remain. And you have to see how that goes. They've said that they'll let women continue to study in schools and whatnot, but not all groups actually adhere to that. So, there's statements being made, but we have to see what happens on the ground.
Yeah, totally. Miriam Berger of the Washington Post, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.